I was 40 feet up a wobbling scaffold with a soldering iron in one hand and a sheet of cobalt glass balanced against my knee when my phone buzzed against my ribcage hard enough that I nearly put the iron through the wrong pane. I braced the glass, set the tool down on its ceramic rest, and checked the screen with the kind of dread that only comes from knowing exactly who texts you in the middle of a Tuesday workday. The clasp was still warm from my hand when I realized whose initials were stamped inside it. Not the necklace, the locket. Small, oval, gold gone thin at the edges from decades of thumbs rubbing over it. I'd pulled it out of a cardboard flat marked Lot 14. Unclaimed, one of 40 identical boxes a storage facility off Colfax had sold me sight unseen for $1,100, the way I bought half my inventory. Most lots were worthless. Rusted watches, costume rings, a drawer of tangled chains I'd melt down for scrap. This one wasn't going in the scrap pile. I turned it toward the lamp on my workbench, and my thumbnail found the tiny engraving on the back panel, worn almost smooth. GA. And beneath it, a date I didn't need a jeweler's loupe to place, because I already knew it. March the 9th. I'd have known that date blind, in the dark, 20 years from now. My hands don't shake at work. 12 years restoring other people's heirlooms teaches you stillness, or it teaches you nothing at all. But they shook then, holding a piece of jewelry that belonged to a woman who'd been dead since I was 13 years old. Grace Ainsley, Sophie's mother. I set the locket down on the velvet pad like it might bruise, and for a long moment I just stood there in my shop after closing, alone with the smell of polish and old brass, trying to remember how a dead woman's necklace ends up in a storage unit auctioned off for non-payment. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that 18 years earlier, I was the boy who sat behind Sophie Ainsley in 7th grade science and spent most of that year watching the back of her neck instead of the diagrams on the board, and that this locket had hung there, on that neck, every single day until the week her mother's funeral happened and Sophie simply stopped coming to school. I never learned where she went. Nobody did. Her family just folded up and disappeared from Denver like a tent struck in the night. And by high school her name had become one of those names people mentioned and then let drop, the way you do with a kid who vanished before anyone worked up the nerve to ask her how she was really doing. I hadn't thought about Sophie Ainsley in years. Not really. Not on purpose. Now her mother's locket was sitting on my workbench, and I couldn't make myself close the drawer on it and walk away. I run a restoration shop 2 blocks off Larimer Street, the kind of place that survives on wedding rings brought back from the dead and grandmother's brooches nobody trusts to a chain store. My grandfather built the business with his own 2 hands and left it to me along with his tools, his patience, and one piece of advice he repeated so often it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like scripture. Anything can be repaired if you're willing to go slow enough. He wasn't only talking about metal. I understood that even as a kid, watching him solder a stranger's broken chain back into a circle like it mattered, like the object was carrying something heavier than gold. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept the locket in my coat pocket instead of the shop's safe, which wasn't procedure, but procedure had never applied to something like this. By morning, I'd made a decision that had nothing to do with profit margins. I was going to find her. It took 4 days and one favor from a woman named Priya, who's worked the front counter of my shop since before I owned it, and who has never once let me get away with a bad idea without saying so first. "You want to track down a girl you knew for 1 school year," she said, arms folded, watching me scroll through property records like a man losing an argument with himself. 18 years ago, based on a necklace, her mother's necklace. That makes it more reasonable how, exactly? I didn't have a good answer. I only had the date engraved on the back, and the memory of Sophie's fingers going to her collarbone every time a teacher raised their voice, like the locket was something she could hold on to when the room got too loud. I remembered that detail with a clarity that embarrassed me a little, considering how long it had been. Priya found her in about 20 minutes, because Priya is better at this than she lets on. Sophie Ainsley, now Sophie Marsh, One short marriage that hadn't stuck, according to the public records, though Priya had the decency not to say that part out loud. Worked as an elementary school art teacher on the west side of the city, 15 minutes from my shop. She'd been 15 minutes away the whole time. I stood outside her classroom on a Tuesday afternoon, holding a small velvet box like it might explode. I almost left twice. Through the narrow window in the door, I could see her crouched beside a kid's desk, hair pulled back, sleeves pushed up, laughing at something a 7-year-old had said with her whole face. The way people only laugh when they've stopped performing for anyone. She looked older, obviously. She also looked exactly like herself, in the way that matters more. The bell rang before I could decide whether I was brave enough. Kids poured past me into the hallway, and then she was standing in the doorway with a stack of construction paper in her arms, looking at me the way you look at a stranger who's parked himself outside your classroom. "Can I help you?" Her voice hadn't changed either. That threw me more than her face did. "I don't know if you remember me," I said. "Daniel Reyes. We had Mrs. Callum's science class together. 7th grade. Something moved behind her eyes, slow, like she was digging through a box she hadn't opened in a long time. "You sat behind me," she said finally, and it wasn't a question. "I did. You used to draw in the margins of your notebook instead of taking notes on cell mitosis." I hadn't expected her to remember that. It knocked something loose in my chest. "I remember you had a locket," I said. "You wore it every day that year." Her hand went to her collarbone. Empty. The gesture happened before she seemed to register she was doing it, and I watched her catch herself, watched her face do something complicated and fast. "I lost it a long time ago," she said, and her voice had changed now, gone careful in a way it hadn't been 30 seconds earlier. "Why are you asking me about a necklace, Daniel?" I opened the box instead of answering. She didn't make a sound at first. She just looked at it, the construction paper sliding out of her arms and scattering across the classroom floor in bright, forgotten colors, and neither of us moved to pick it up. "Where?" she said. Just that. Not even a full sentence. "I restore estate jewelry. I buy unclaimed storage lots sometimes, when the units go to auction. This came through 3 weeks ago. I saw the engraving and I recognized the date. You remembered my mother's birthday." "I remembered the day she died," I said quietly. "You wore it to school after for a while. I noticed things like that about you." Sophie sat down hard in the nearest child-sized chair, knees nearly at her chest, and cried in a way that had clearly been waiting a very long time for permission. I crouched beside her, close enough to be present, careful not to be intrusive, and let her cry without filling the silence with anything that would have cheapened it. "I told everyone I lost it," she finally said, wiping her face with the back of her wrist. "For 18 years. I told my aunt I lost it packing up the house after my mom died, and she told me it wasn't my fault, and I let her keep believing that because the truth was worse." "What's the truth?" Sophie looked up at me, and something in her expression made the empty classroom feel very small. "I didn't lose it," she said. "My stepfather did." Part 2. We ended up at a coffee shop 3 blocks from her school because neither of us wanted to keep talking in a room built for 7-year-olds, and because Sophie needed somewhere she could fall apart a little further without an audience of finger paintings watching her do it. She held the locket in both hands the entire time, like she was afraid it might disappear again if she set it on the table. "My stepfather, David, moved in with us about a year after the funeral," she said. "He wasn't a bad man. He just wasn't good with money, and he was terrible at asking for help, and somewhere around my 16th birthday we lost the house. He put everything we couldn't fit into the new apartment into a storage unit and told me he'd figure it out. He didn't figure it out. He stopped paying on it within a year. Never told me. I found out when I was 22, going through his things after he passed, and by then the unit had already been emptied and sold off for non-payment years before. Everything in it. My mom's jewelry, her letters, photo albums that existed nowhere else." Her voice thinned out on that last part. "I've spent my whole adult life believing I lost the last physical pieces of her because I wasn't careful enough. And it turns out I never even had the chance to be careful. It was already gone before I knew to be scared of losing it. I thought about my grandfather's rule. Anything can be repaired if you're willing to go slow enough. I didn't say it out loud. It felt too small for what she'd just handed me. There might be more, I said instead. If this came from that unit, the rest of the lot might still be in my shop. I haven't finished sorting it. Sophie's head came up fast. You have more? I don't know yet. I need to check. I stopped going through the box the second I found the locket. I have never in 12 years closed my shop on a weekday afternoon for a personal errand. Priya didn't even ask when I called her and told her I was bringing someone in. We spent 3 hours on the floor of my back room going through lot 14 piece by piece, and it turned out to be more than jewelry. A cigar box of photographs, curling at the corners. A stack of letters tied with a ribbon that had gone the color of weak tea. A woman's wristwatch that had stopped at some point years ago and never been wound again. Sophie held up a photograph of a young woman laughing on a porch somewhere, dark-haired, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten before Sophie even said it. That's her, she whispered. That's my mom. I watched a woman meet her dead mother's face again through a box of things a stranger had bought for $1,100, and something in me reorganized itself completely. Right there on the floor of my workshop, surrounded by other people's forgotten things. I'm going to clean these, I said. The photographs, the letters. I know how to stabilize paper that's been water damaged or handled too much. It'll take some time. You don't have to do that. I want to. Sophie looked at me for a long moment, the locket still closed in her fist. Why does this matter so much to you? She asked. You barely knew me. I could have given her an easy answer. I almost did. Instead, I told her the truth, because something about the day seemed to demand it. I've spent my whole career putting broken things back together for strangers, I said. I don't usually know what a piece meant to somebody before it landed on my bench. This is the first time I've known exactly what it was worth, before I even opened the box. I couldn't have handed this to anyone else and walked away. She didn't answer that right away. She reached over instead and set her hand briefly over mine, just above the cigar box, just long enough that I felt it after she'd already pulled away. Thank you, she said, for coming to find me. I almost didn't. Why not? Because 18 years is a long time to show up somewhere uninvited. Something shifted in her face, softer than before. I'm glad you did, she said, even with everything it stirred up. I'm glad. We spent the rest of that week trading messages that started practical. Updates on the letters I was steaming open, a photograph I'd managed to save from water damage that she cried over again when I sent it to her, and slowly stopped being practical at all. By Thursday, she was telling me about her classroom's disastrous papier-mâché unit. By Friday, I was telling her things about my grandfather I hadn't said out loud since his funeral. Saturday, she showed up at my shop without texting first, holding 2 coffees, and asked if she could watch me work. Part 3. Sophie sat on the stool across my bench for 4 hours that Saturday, mostly quiet, watching me steam a decades-old envelope open along its seam with a patience I didn't expect from someone who'd never seen the process before. It's slower than I thought it would be, she said eventually. Rushing it tears the paper. You have to let the moisture do the work instead of forcing it. That sounds like a metaphor you use a lot. My grandfather used to say it about the jewelry, but he meant it about everything. People included. She smiled, small and real, the first one I'd seen from her that didn't have grief sitting right behind it. Did you use it on me? Slowing down instead of forcing it. I walked into your classroom holding a jewelry box after not speaking to you for 18 years, I said. I don't think I get to claim patience there. You waited 4 days to find me. You let me cry in a room full of finger paintings without saying anything that would have made it about you instead of her. That's more patience than most people manage in a week, let alone a first conversation. I didn't have a response for that one that wouldn't have given away more than I was ready to. We fell into a rhythm neither of us planned. She came by the shop most weekends. I finished restoring the letters, 19 of them, mostly between her mother and an aunt in Albuquerque, full of small, ordinary things that turned out to matter enormously once you understood how few of them were left. I repaired the clasp on the locket itself, replaced the worn hinge, polished 18 years of tarnish-off gold that had been sitting in the dark far longer than it should have. The night I gave it back to her, properly restored, we were sitting on the tailgate of my truck outside her apartment, the city doing its quiet blue thing above the rooftops. "It looks new," she said, turning it over in the streetlight. "It isn't. It just isn't tired anymore." She fastened it around her neck without asking me to help, and her hand went to it the way it must have gone 1,000 times when she was 13, an old habit finding its way home. "I used to think losing this meant losing the last piece of her that was actually mine," she said. "Not photographs everyone else's copies of. Not stories other people tell better than I remember them. This was mine, and I thought I'd let it slip through my fingers because I wasn't careful enough with the one thing that mattered most." "You didn't lose anything," I said. "Somebody else made a decision you never got to make. That's a different kind of grief than the one you've been carrying. I know that now. I didn't know it a month ago." She looked over at me. "You gave me that back too. Not just the necklace." The space between us on that tailgate had been shrinking all evening without either of us naming it. I don't know which of us closed the last few inches. I only know that when I kissed her, it felt less like something new starting and more like something interrupted 18 years ago finally being allowed to continue. She pulled back only far enough to look at me, her forehead nearly touching mine. "I didn't expect this," she whispered. "Any of it. The necklace, the letters, you." "Neither did I. I bought a storage lot for $1,100 expecting scrap metal. Romantic. I'm a jeweler, not a poet." She laughed against my mouth, and I kissed her again, slower this time. No 18 years of hesitation left between us to account for. We spent the next 2 months the way people spend the beginning of something they've quietly decided is worth being careful with. Sunday dinners at my apartment. Evenings at her place grading second-grade art projects while I repaired a stranger's watch on her kitchen table because I couldn't sit still without my hands doing something. She met Priya, who approved of her within 10 minutes, and told me so bluntly the second Sophie left the room. I met her Aunt Carol, who'd raised her through the worst years and who studied me over dinner with the particular suspicion of a woman who'd watched Sophie get hurt before and had no interest in watching it happen again. "You're the one who found her mother's things," Carol said, not quite a question. "I am. That's either the kindest thing anyone's done for her in a decade, or the most complicated way to start a relationship I've ever heard of." "Possibly both," I admitted. Carol studied me a moment longer, then nodded once, like I'd passed some test I hadn't known I was taking. "Good," she said. "She deserves both." By the 3rd month, Sophie had a drawer at my apartment, and I had a key to hers, and neither of us had said the word love out loud yet, though it sat close enough to the surface of most conversations that saying it felt more like a formality than a revelation. Then, on an ordinary Thursday, everything got complicated again. Part 4. Sophie called me from her aunt's kitchen, sounding like someone trying very hard to keep her voice level. "I found something in David's old files," she said. Carol had a box of his paperwork she never went through. "There's a letter from the storage facility. From years before I thought." "What kind of letter?" "A final notice. Dated 8 months before my mother's actual funeral, Daniel." Her voice cracked on the date. "He started falling behind on payments while she was still sick. Before she even died. He knew the unit was at risk for months, and he never said anything. Not to her. Not to me. He let it happen slowly, and then he let me believe it happened all at once, years later, in a moment nobody could have prevented." I sat with that for a second, understanding immediately why it had unmade something in her. "That changes the story you've been telling yourself," I said carefully. "It changes everything. I built an entire understanding of my own grief around a version of events that wasn't even true. I don't know how to feel about him anymore. I don't know how to feel about any of it. I don't know how to feel about the fact that you're the reason I found this out at all." That last part landed harder than I expected. "Do you wish I hadn't come to your classroom that day?" I asked, because I needed to know, even if I wasn't ready for the answer. There was a long pause on the line. No, she finally said, but I need some space to sit with this. Not from you. From all of it. I need to figure out who I am now that the story I told myself for 18 years isn't the real one. I understood. I told her I understood. It still hurt more than I let on. Then stop admitting it to me, Vivian said, standing and smoothing her dress, and go find her before my sister-in-law does, because Carol has already started planning a second wedding, and I would very much like to enjoy my first daughter's ceremony without competing gossip. I found Josie exactly where I expected, back at the dock, staring at the water with her shoes off and her dress pulled around her ankles. How bad was it? She asked without turning around. Better than I expected. Your mother might actually tolerate me by Christmas. Josie laughed, surprised and relieved all at once. That's practically a marriage proposal from her. I sat down beside her, the wood still warm from the day's sun. I need to ask you something, and it isn't part of the arrangement. She turned to face me fully. Ask. When this weekend ends tomorrow, I don't want to go back to being just your friend who occasionally fixes windows and shows up to movie nights. I want the version of this we built the last 2 days. The real one. Not because your mother finally seemed to approve, and not because it's convenient timing with a wedding happening around us. Because somewhere between the porch and this dock, I stopped pretending and started meaning it. Josie's eyes shone in the low light. I was going to give a whole speech about this, she said, but you beat me to the honest version, so I'll just say it plainly. I don't want to go back either. That's a relief, because I already told your mother I cared about you, and it would be deeply embarrassing to walk that back now. You told my mother before you told me? She cornered me. I panicked into honesty. Josie laughed and pulled me toward her, and I kissed her under a sky just beginning to fill with stars. No audience left to perform for, nothing fake left in either of us. For the record, she murmured against my mouth, "You're a terrible fake boyfriend. Worst in the business. Excellent real one, though. Early reviews are promising." Epilogue. The wedding went beautifully the next day, mostly because Vivian spent it introducing me to relatives as Josephine's Caleb instead of Dennis Hart's son, which I decided to count as a genuine turning point in diplomatic relations. My own father, when I finally called him from the parking lot that Sunday and told him where I'd spent the weekend, went silent on the phone for almost a full minute before saying only that he owed some people in that town an apology he'd been avoiding for 20 years. He drove up 3 weeks later. I still don't know everything that was said in Vivian's kitchen that afternoon, but he came out of it looking lighter than I'd seen him in years, and Vivian started sending him invitations to things she never used to send. Josie and I did not need a fake arrangement again after that weekend. We built the real thing slowly, deliberately, the way you rebuild something you actually intend to keep. A year later, I proposed to her under the rose window at St. Aldrich's, in the exact spot where her father had once proposed to her mother, using a ring I'd set into a small pane of hand-blown glass shaped like a swallow, because Josie once told me swallows always find their way home no matter how far they've flown. Vivian cried through the entire thing, loudly, and later admitted she'd suspected it was coming for at least 2 months, because I'd started asking her opinion on ring settings with far too much fake casualness for a man who claimed he wasn't planning anything. We were married the following spring, under that same window, with both of our families finally sitting on the same side of an old argument instead of 2 sides of it. My father gave a short, careful toast about second chances and unfinished business, and Vivian, unprompted, raised her glass to him before anyone else did. Sometimes Josie still teases me about the 4 months we supposedly dated before that wedding weekend, the story we invented to satisfy her family's curiosity. Now, whenever anyone asks how long we've actually been together, she just smiles and says it depends whether you're counting from the fake part or the part that mattered. What would you have done if your best friend's mother recognized your last name, and it turned out to connect to a secret your own family had been hiding for decades? Have you ever had a weekend favor turn into something you never planned on? Tell me your story in the comments. And for those who'd like to be a little closer to us, we've opened memberships where you'll get shorter exclusive stories every week with no ads. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.